Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine a land so ancient, so vast, and so full of wonder that even the wind seems to carry the whispers of kings and conquerors. Imagine a civilization that rose before most of the world had even learned to write, a people who built empires while others were still learning to build walls. Imagine a place where the mountains touched the clouds, where rivers ran like silver threads across golden plains, and where human beings first dared to dream of ruling the entire known world. That place had a name, and that name was Persia. This is not simply a story about a country changing its name on a map. This is a story about identity, survival, transformation, and the unbreakable spirit of a people who refused to disappear, no matter how many times the storms of history tried to erase them. To truly understand how Persia became Iran, we must go all the way back to the very beginning, to a time so remote that most people today have never even heard the names of the tribes who first walked across that ancient plateau. Thousands of years before the birth of Christ, long before the great empires of the ancient world had risen to their heights, groups of people known as the Aryans began migrating southward from the vast steppes of Central Asia. These were not a single unified nation. They were a collection of related tribes, speaking similar languages, sharing similar customs, and driven by a common hunger for fertile land and stable pasture. Over many generations, two of these tribal groups became particularly significant. One group settled in the western highlands and became known as the Medes. The other group moved further south and settled in a region they would come to call Parsa. It is from this ancient tribal homeland, this place called Parsa, that the entire world would one day come to know the name Persia. Life on the Iranian plateau was never easy. The landscape itself was a test of human endurance, with towering mountain ranges cutting across the land, vast salt deserts baking under a merciless sun, and winters cold enough to freeze the courage out of lesser people. But these early settlers were not lesser people. They were tough, resourceful, and deeply connected to the natural world around them. They raised horses on the highland plains, worshipped fire as a sacred gift from the divine, and developed a rich spiritual tradition that would eventually give birth to one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, a faith known as Zoroastrianism. This ancient belief system, founded by the prophet Zarathustra, taught that the universe was locked in an eternal struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, between light and darkness, between truth and the lie. These ideas were so powerful, so deeply revolutionary, that they would go on to shape the thinking of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in ways that most people today never fully appreciate. For centuries, the Medes were the dominant power on the plateau. They built a powerful kingdom, formed alliances, fought wars, and even partnered with the Babylonians to bring down the mighty Assyrian Empire, one of the most feared military powers the ancient world had ever seen. But history has a way of reshuffling the deck when you least expect it. Around the year 550 BCE, a man appeared on the stage of history whose ambition, brilliance, and vision were unlike anything the ancient world had witnessed before. His name was Cyrus, and the world would come to call him Cyrus the Great. Born into the royal house of the Persian tribe, Cyrus had grown up watching the Medes rule over his people. He had seen the humiliation of Persian nobles forced to bow before Median kings. And somewhere deep inside that quiet, calculating mind of his, he had decided that things were going to change. What happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. Cyrus rose up against the Median king, Astyages, and through a combination of military genius, political skill, and remarkable personal charisma, he united the Medes and the Persians under a single banner for the very first time. This was not just a military victory. It was the birth of something entirely new. It was the beginning of the Achaemenid Empire, the first Persian Empire, a political entity so large, so sophisticated, and so far ahead of its time that historians still marvel at it today. Under Cyrus and his successors, this empire would stretch from the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west all the way to the borders of India in the east, encompassing dozens of nations, hundreds of languages, and millions of people under one extraordinarily tolerant and visionary form of rule. What made this empire truly remarkable was not simply its size. It was the spirit in which it was governed. Cyrus the Great issued what many historians consider to be the world's first declaration of human rights, a clay cylinder inscribed with promises of religious freedom, the right of conquered peoples to return to their homelands, and a commitment to ruling with justice rather than terror. This was a revolutionary idea in a world where conquerors typically celebrated their victories by burning cities and enslaving populations. The Persian way was different, and that difference would echo through the centuries, shaping the identity of a people who even today carry the memory of Cyrus in their hearts with immense and quiet pride. The empire that Cyrus built did not stop growing when he died. If anything, his successors looked at what he had created and saw not a finished monument, but a foundation, a starting point from which something even greater could be constructed. His son Cambyses pushed the borders of the empire southward into Egypt, adding the ancient land of the pharaohs to Persian rule. And then came Darius I, a man of such extraordinary administrative genius that he transformed what had been a collection of conquered territories into something that functioned like a genuine civilization. Darius divided the empire into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a trusted official, each connected to the imperial center by a network of roads so well built and so efficiently maintained that messages could travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of days. This was not just an empire of soldiers and swords. This was an empire of systems, of laws, of trade, and of ideas. Under Darius, the Persian Empire reached the absolute peak of its organizational power. He standardized weights and measures across dozens of different cultures, introduced a common currency to facilitate trade, and oversaw the construction of one of the ancient world's most breathtaking architectural achievements, the great ceremonial capital of Persepolis. Rising from a massive stone platform on the plains of Fars, Persepolis was not simply a palace, it was a statement. Its towering columns, its magnificent staircases carved with the images of delegations from every corner of the empire, bringing gifts to the Persian king. Its vast audience halls where the ruler of the known world received ambassadors from nations as far away as Ethiopia and India. All of it spoke of a civilization that understood beauty, power, and the deep human need for symbols of shared identity. When you walked through the gates of Persepolis, you understood immediately that you were standing inside something that had never existed before in the history of the world. But empires, no matter how magnificent, carry within themselves the seeds of their own vulnerability. The Greeks, particularly the fiercely independent city-states of Athens and Sparta, refused to bow before Persian power. The wars between Persia and Greece, which unfolded across the late 5th and early 4th centuries BCE, became some of the most famous military conflicts in all of human history. The battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis entered the mythology of the Western world, celebrated for centuries as stories of brave underdogs standing against an overwhelming force. From the Greek perspective, they were fighting for freedom against tyranny. From the Persian perspective, they were dealing with rebellious Western provinces that refused to accept the natural order of things. History, as always, depends entirely on who is doing the telling. The Persian Empire survived those Greek wars, but it never fully recovered its earlier momentum. Decades of internal court intrigue, assassinations, and power struggles among the royal family slowly weakened the iron grip of central authority. Satraps in distant provinces began acting more like independent kings than loyal governors. The military, once the most formidable fighting force in the known world, began to rely more heavily on Greek mercenaries, which was a quiet but deeply telling sign of institutional decline. And then, from the rugged and relatively poor kingdom of Macedonia in northern Greece, a young man appeared, whose hunger for conquest and whose sheer military brilliance would shake the ancient world to its very foundations. His name was Alexander, and history would give him the same title it had once given to Cyrus. They would call him the Great. Alexander's campaign against Persia was swift, devastating, and almost incomprehensible in its speed. Between 334 and 330 BCE, he defeated the Persian armies at 3 major battles, marched through the heart of the empire, and eventually stood inside the halls of Persepolis itself. What happened next became one of history's most debated moments. Persepolis was burned. Whether Alexander ordered the destruction deliberately as an act of symbolic revenge for the Persian burning of Athens, or whether it happened in a night of drunken celebration that spiraled out of control, historians have argued about for centuries. What is beyond debate is the image of those magnificent columns standing against a sky lit orange by the flames, the greatest symbol of Persian imperial power reduced to ash and ruin in a single night. Yet here is the extraordinary thing, the thing that makes the Persian story so different from the stories of so many other fallen empires. Persia did not die with Alexander. The Persian people, their language, their culture, their art, their spiritual traditions, their deep and ancient sense of who they were, all of it survived. Alexander himself, within just a few years of his conquest, began adopting Persian customs, wearing Persian robes, surrounding himself with Persian advisors, and encouraging his generals to marry Persian women. The conqueror had been conquered by the culture of the people he had defeated. This pattern, this remarkable ability of Persian civilization to absorb its conquerors and transform them from the inside, would repeat itself again and again across the coming centuries and become one of the most defining features of the Iranian story. The centuries that followed Alexander's conquest were centuries of layering, of one civilization pressing itself onto another like geological strata, each era leaving its mark on the deep rock of Persian identity without ever fully erasing what came before. The Greek successors of Alexander, known as the Seleucids, ruled over the Iranian plateau for roughly a century and a half, spreading Greek language, Greek art, and Greek philosophy across territories that had once marched to a very different cultural drum. Greek became the language of administration. Greek-style cities with their columned temples and open-air theaters appeared across the landscape. And yet, beneath all of this Hellenistic surface, the Persian soul continued to breathe. The people remembered their language, they remembered their stories, they remembered Cyrus and Darius and the glory of what had once been. Memory, it turns out, is the most durable material in all of human history. Empires can be toppled, capitals can be burned, but the stories a people tell about themselves around their fires at night are almost impossible to destroy. Around 247 BCE, a new power rose from the eastern edges of the plateau. The Parthians, an Iranian people from the region southeast of the Caspian Sea, began pushing back against Seleucid rule with a ferocity and determination that caught the Greek rulers completely off guard. Under their early kings, the Parthians expanded steadily westward, reclaiming territory that the Persians had once called their own. By around 141 BCE, they had taken the ancient Mesopotamian city of Ctesiphon and made it their capital, positioning themselves as the dominant power across a vast stretch of territory stretching from the Euphrates River in the west to the borders of India in the east. The Parthians were masterful horsemen and brilliant military tacticians. Their cavalry, armed with powerful bows and capable of firing arrows at full gallop in any direction, including backwards, became the stuff of legend and gave the world the phrase that survives to this very day, the idea of delivering a parting shot as you ride away, forever known as a Parthian shot. But the Parthian Empire, for all its military brilliance, was always somewhat loosely organized. A confederation of semi-independent nobles rather than a tightly controlled central state. And it was precisely this structural weakness that eventually opened the door for yet another remarkable Persian resurrection. In 224 CE, a local ruler named Ardashir from the ancient Persian heartland of Fars, the very same region where the story of Persia had first begun centuries earlier, rose up against the last Parthian king, defeated him in battle, and declared himself the ruler of a new empire. Ardashir claimed direct descent from the ancient Achaemenid kings, wrapping his new dynasty in the golden legitimacy of Cyrus and Darius. He called his new empire the Sasanian Empire, and what the Sasanians built over the next 4 centuries was nothing less than a second golden age of Persian civilization. A deliberate and passionate revival of everything that had made the first Persian Empire so extraordinary. And now, dear listener, pause here for just a moment. Because what is coming next in this story is something that no Persian king, no matter how powerful, no matter how wise, could have predicted or prepared for. Something was stirring far to the southwest, in the burning deserts of Arabia, that would change not just Persia but the entire world in ways so profound and so permanent that we are still living inside those changes today. A new faith had been born, A new community of believers was growing with a speed and a conviction that astonished everyone who witnessed it. And that community, armed with a message they believed came directly from God and fueled by a military energy that seemed almost supernatural in its force and coordination, was about to turn its eyes northward toward the ancient plateau of Iran. The Sasanian Empire, exhausted by decades of devastating wars with the Byzantine Romans to its west, was about to face the greatest storm it had ever encountered. And this time, unlike all the previous storms, there would be no going back to what had existed before. The Arab Muslim armies that burst out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 630s CE moved with a speed and a ferocity that left the ancient world struggling to comprehend what was happening. The Sasanian Empire, which had seemed so permanent, so deeply rooted in the soil of the Iranian plateau, collapsed with a swiftness that shocked both those doing the conquering and those being conquered. The last Sasanian emperor, Yazdegerd III, fled eastward before the advancing Arab armies, desperately seeking allies, desperately trying to rally resistance, until he was finally killed near the city of Merv in 651 CE, alone, abandoned, and far from the palaces of his ancestors. An empire that had stood for over 4 centuries, that had produced extraordinary art, literature, philosophy, and religious thought, had fallen in less than 2 decades. Yet once again, as had happened with Alexander, as had happened with the Seleucids, as had happened with the Parthians, Persian civilization proved itself to be something far deeper and far more resilient than any political structure built above it. The Iranian people accepted the new faith of Islam, but they did not dissolve into it. They shaped it, enriched it, and transformed it from the inside with the full weight of their ancient intellectual and cultural inheritance. Persian became one of the great languages of Islamic civilization. Persian poets, philosophers, scientists, and administrators became the backbone of the early Islamic world. And slowly, quietly, with the patience of a people who had already survived a dozen conquests, the Iranian identity began preparing itself for yet another extraordinary chapter. The story of how Persian identity survived inside the world of Islamic civilization is one of the most fascinating and least told stories in all of human history. When the Arab conquest reshaped the political landscape of the Iranian plateau, it did not find a blank canvas waiting to be painted upon. It found a civilization of extraordinary depth, one that had already absorbed Greeks and Parthians and Sasanians, and had emerged from each encounter not weakened but somehow enriched, somehow more fully itself. The early centuries of Islamic rule saw Iranian scholars, administrators, poets, and thinkers rise to positions of enormous influence within the new order. The Abbasid Caliphate, which replaced the earlier Umayyad dynasty in 750 CE and moved the center of Islamic power to the newly built city of Baghdad, was in many ways as much a Persian empire as it was an Arab one. Persian bureaucrats ran its ministries. Persian architects designed its palaces, Persian philosophers debated in its academies, and Persian poets began composing verses in their ancient tongue that would eventually be recognized as some of the greatest literature the human race has ever produced. It was during these centuries that the Persian language itself underwent a quiet but profound transformation. The Old Middle Persian of the Sasanian era absorbed Arabic vocabulary, adopted the Arabic script, and emerged as a new literary language of stunning beauty and expressive power. This new Persian, sometimes called Dari or Classical Persian, became the vehicle for a literary explosion that produced names still celebrated across the world today. Ferdowsi, working for 30 years in magnificent isolation, composed the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, an epic poem of 60,000 verses that retold the entire mythological and historical story of Persia from the beginning of time to the Arab conquest. It was an act of cultural preservation so heroic, so deliberate, and so beautifully executed that it essentially saved the Persian language from extinction. Omar Khayyam peered at the stars and wrote quatrains of such piercing wisdom about life, time, and the human condition that they are still being read and loved in dozens of languages 8 centuries after his death. Rumi poured his spiritual longing into poetry so luminous and so universally human that he became one of the most widely read poets in the modern world, not just in Iran, but across every continent on earth. By the 9th and 10th centuries, as the central authority of the Abbasid Caliphate began to weaken, a series of Iranian dynasties began reasserting political independence across the plateau. The Tahirids, the Safarids, the Samanids, each of these dynasties pushed back against Arab political dominance while remaining fully committed to the Islamic faith. They were not rejecting Islam. They were insisting that being Iranian and being Muslim were not contradictory identities, but complementary ones. That a person could bow toward Mecca 5 times a day and still carry Cyrus in their heart, still recite Ferdowsi by firelight, still feel the ancient mountains of the plateau as the bones of their own deepest identity. This reconciliation of faith and cultural memory became the defining spiritual and intellectual achievement of medieval Iranian civilization, and it produced a richness of thought, art, and human experience that the world has rarely seen equaled. The centuries continued to turn. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century brought devastation on a scale that even the Arab conquest had not matched. Cities were leveled, populations were massacred, irrigation systems built over thousands of years were destroyed in a matter of weeks. And yet, within a generation, the Mongol rulers of Iran were themselves converting to Islam, patronizing Persian art and literature, and presiding over courts where the Persian language remained the language of culture and refinement. The pattern repeated itself once more, so consistently that it begins to feel less like coincidence and more like a fundamental law of Iranian civilizational life. Conquerors arrive. Conquerors are absorbed. Persian culture continues. The name Iran itself, the name that officially replaced Persia on the world stage in 1935, is deeply revealing about everything this story has been trying to say. The word Iran comes directly from the ancient word Ariana, meaning the land of the Aryans, referring to those ancient tribal migrants who first walked onto the plateau thousands of years before Cyrus was born. When Reza Shah Pahlavi, the modernizing ruler of 20th century Iran, asked the international community to use the name Iran rather than the Greek-derived Persia, he was not creating something new. He was reaching all the way back to the oldest layer of his people's identity and pulling it forward into the modern world. He was saying, in the most direct way possible, that this land and this people had a name for themselves that was older than any empire, older than any conquest, older than any of the storms that had tried and failed to wash them away. And so the answer to the question of how Persia became Iran is not really about a name change at all. It is about a civilization that proved, across more than 2,500 years of recorded history, that identity is not a fragile thing. It is not something that shatters when armies cross your borders, or when your capital city burns, or when your kings fall in the dust of foreign battlefields. Identity, true identity, the kind rooted in language and story and memory, and the particular way a people looks at the mountains and the sky of their homeland, that kind of identity is nearly indestructible. Persia did not become Iran. Persia always was Iran. The world simply needed a few thousand years to learn the name that the people had always called themselves, standing on their ancient plateau, under their ancient sky, carrying their ancient and unbreakable sense of who they truly are. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.